So let me ask you, some of you guys are still in high school, not yet in high school. Some of us have been out of high school for a long time. But in high school, do they still do this, Jaden? I'll ask you because you're in high school right now. In the yearbook where they vote like most likely to succeed or most likely to be president. Okay, so they still do that. All right. So if you were voted anything, you don't have to share. I'm not going to make you. But what would you have been most voted for in high school? Okay, most likely to succeed, most likely to be president, most likely to rule the world, most likely to blow up the world, like whatever you were most likely would have been if you were when you were in high school. And then now for a lot of us, it's been more than 10 years since high school. So has that come to pass in your life? Or if you know of the kids in your high school when you were in high school, like the most popular kids, the ones who were like, I don't know, prom queen or whatever else, like all the popular ones that were most likely to succeed if they continued at that rate, where are they now? If you know them on like social media, where are they now? How are they living? Some of them have not ended up that way, okay? Because time has a way of changing a lot of things. So here in our volume, Land and Lost today, we go into the book of Ruth. So this time period is the same as the book of Judges. So we just wrapped up the book of Judges, but that time frame of when the judges were ruling the land of Israel, that's the same time frame the story of Ruth happens. We just don't know which judge it was during which time, but we know it was one of the same times. So here we have this new book. Some context, which is important. Ruth is only 4 chapters. It's very short, and it's a fan favorite because there's everything. There's famine, there's loss, there's suffering, there's homecoming, there's love, there's redemption. Like it has it all, the story, okay? But if you pull back and look at these 4 chapters, there's a couple main ideas, but 2 main themes that I want to highlight. The first one is this. In the book of Ruth, you could count on your hand the number of times that God is mentioned. So God is mentioned very few times, actually, in the book of Ruth. In passing, like Naomi or Ruth will talk about God, and will give praise and glory to him, but the author never mentions God, like the narrator of the story, never mentions God. And so one of the things that we see, one of the biggest themes we see in this book is that in the everyday joy and suffering of life, like the joy of getting married, finding love, moving to a new place, in the suffering of losing your father, your husband, your son, in the everyday things of life, we see that God is working in and through all of those things for his glory and for his good. Okay? That is one of the biggest themes. If you don't remember anything, this is what you're supposed to remember, okay? In the book of Ruth, we see that in all the joys, in all the suffering of everyday life, God is working in and through all of those everyday things for his glory, for his good, and for your and my good. And we're going to see how God does that in Ruth's story. Another theme that's really important in the book of Ruth is the idea of redemption. Redemption. So look on the screen. Definition for redemption on the front and the back. So a simple definition is to take or buy something back. Okay? So say you owned a house, okay? And then you lost everything because you put all your money into the wrong stock and it crashed, okay? You lost your house, it's foreclosed, everything goes away. And then you get money and you buy that house back. That's redeeming something, okay? Paying what is required to liberate someone from oppression or enslavement. So this theme of redemption is also all throughout the book of Ruth. So keep in mind those 2 themes because those 2 themes actually have a lot to tell us about God and how God works in our lives today, even still. Through the story of Ruth, we see how even through brokenness and sin, God is always at work to redeem his people, to bring them back to right relationship with him. That's always God's goal. Always. Okay, so here we are. Let's start. Book of Ruth, 1:1. The time of Judges, severe famine came. What was the judges' pattern, remember? Do good for a while, judge dies. Israel falls back into sin, and one of the ways that God gets their attention is by political unrest and famine. Those are the two ways that God gets Israel's attention. So the Ruth starts with a famine, which tells us that where is Israel in that cycle of sin? They are not doing well. They have wandered away from God again, okay? And so they're not doing well. And that famine is supposed to be a wake-up call. But we see that instead of waking up, instead of repenting, instead of going back to God, we see one family leave the promised land. Leave the promised land to go to Moab. And Moab was one of Israel's enemies. Do you guys know the root of Moab? Where Moab came from? So who remembers way back in Genesis, Abraham was supposed to leave with his family, only his immediate wife, to go to the promised land, right? Who did he bring along with him, though? His nephew, Lot, right? Was not supposed to bring him with him, but naturally their flocks became too big, so they split up, okay? Lot goes to Sodom and Gomorrah. And that place had so much sin that God rained down judgment, because not one righteous person could be found, except for Lot and his family. As they're escaping, Lot's wife looks back, turns into a pillar of salt, one of the weirdest stories in the Bible, okay? Lot and his two daughters flee, and it's not a great relationship, but there's incest, and therefore, out of that relationship comes a son named Moab, okay? And out of Moab comes the Moabites nation. So they have long connections to each other, but not good connections, okay? And so this family, instead of turning to God, goes to Moab, a land known for its idolatry and a lot of immortality, okay? Outwardly, it was probably looked like a good financial decision because there was food in Moab and there was work. Israel and Bethlehem, nothing. Ironically, Bethlehem, the name Bethlehem is city of bread. There's no bread, okay? And so they're starving. And so they leave. Outwardly, looks like a good idea. But spiritually, we see it was not the right choice for them to make. Now, in that time, in that culture, in that age, to be a woman meant that you were a second-class citizen, okay? That is not what God designed, but that's how society was built at that time, okay? And as a woman, if you don't have a father, or B, a husband, or if you're old, sons to care for you and provide for you, you basically become destitute, like on the streets, poor, begging, prostituting your body, that's how it was during that time. And so Naomi, not by her choice, but by her husband's choice, moved to Moab. Okay, next slide. Then we see husband dies. Naomi's like, great. You move us here to this foreign land. I'm an immigrant, and we're surrounded by sin and idolatry, and you die. If I were Naomi, I don't know how I'd feel, okay? I would be really upset. But she's like, you know what? At least I have two sons. So those two sons marry two Moabite women. They're supposed to marry within their own people, but they're not in their land. So they marry Moabite women. But 10 years later, both of these sons die. What good are sons in that time if they just die, okay? And so we see that this woman who is old, cannot care for herself, has now lost every source of family and every source of financial support and every source of security. All she's left is two daughters-in-law who are not even her own people. And so we see in verse 6 that Naomi hears God has blessed his people by giving them food again, which means that probably at that time they had repented and turned back to God, right? Because over 10 years had gone by. If they had only stayed in that land, if only they had stayed in that land, would they be in the predicament they are now? Okay? But here they are. Naomi hears, okay, there's food again, which means they've repented and God has had mercy upon his people. And so they get ready to go back. But then she realizes, wait, my 2 daughters-in-law, who are foreign women, if we go back, maybe from my extended family, they could help me. But no one's going to want to take these 2 foreign girls who have no sons of their own, who have nothing to their name. Like, they're just going to get worse treatment in Israel than to stay in their hometowns. And so Naomi tells them, go back to your homes because there's no place for you here in my hometown. Like, I can't provide for you. I can barely fend for myself. And so one of the daughters-in-law, whose name is Orpah, she decides to go back. She goes back to her mother's home. And in verse 15, if you go to Ruth 1, verse 15, it shows that she not only went back to her mother's house, but she went back to her Moabite gods, her false gods, okay? But Ruth replied here in verse 16. This is one of the most famous passages in the book of Ruth. It says here, so Naomi said, go. Orpah's gone. Be smart. Like, go home. I cannot take care of you. And Ruth replied, don't ask me to leave you and turn back. Wherever you go, I will go. Wherever you live, I will live. Your people will be my people, and your God will be my God. Wherever you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. So Ruth, even though she's a foreign woman who did not grow up hearing about God, demonstrates more loyalty and faith in God than most of the Israelites at that time. At the end of the book of Ruth, they describe Ruth as more loyal and better than 7 sons. 7 is the number of completion in the Hebrew culture, right? So more than having 7 perfect sons, Ruth is better than all of them, which is a huge compliment at that time because women, again, are not considered very much compared to like a son. So more than 7 sons, Ruth is worth more, is how they end up describing her. And we see through those 4 chapters how Ruth proves her loyalty, but most of all, her faith in God. And so, what we see here is that when your life hits rock bottom, can you think about that? Like, you just got married, you're excited to start your life, and your husband dies, leaving no children. You are now tied to this family very ambiguously because the connection you had to this family is dead. And then you have to go move to a foreign land where you don't know the culture or the language. You have no protection. Why would Ruth want to do that? If it wasn't that she had some semblance of faith. Something about her time with Naomi's family, she realized, wait, my gods, they don't actually work. This God they're talking about, I think he's the real one. Something in Ruth's heart decided, this is the God I'm going to live for. Even though I have nothing to gain, everything to lose, if I follow Naomi and I follow her God, this is the right path for me to take. When you hit rock bottom, when you've lost your family, your security, your safety, what do you really have left? What do you really have left? Nothing but faith or lack of it, one or the other. Because Orpah had the same experience. Married to the same family, saw the same things, but she chose to leave. Ruth chose to stay. So here we are in verse 19. The 2 of them go back. And when they go back, it's a big deal. It's a big deal. Even 10 years later, everyone still remembers Naomi. So we think that probably Naomi came from a pretty well-known family. And if she was in your high school, she would have been one of the most popular girls, probably, Okay, well known, most likely to succeed. She was the prom queen who married the quarterback of the football team. Okay, like this was a big family. Okay, well known, like she was the hot shot. And she leaves and comes back. And it's kind of like if you went back to your high school reunion, which, I don't know, man. It's not great. I haven't been, so I don't know. But it's like if you go back to your high school reunion and you're like, everyone who was cool and all of that is like hit their rock bottom. That's kind of what happened to Naomi's family. So Naomi, her life is not only become bitter, she's become bitter to the point where she's like, don't call me Naomi, call me Mara. I'm so bitter, I'm so resentful. I left full and I came back empty. Look what God has taken away from me. But look at the very last sentence. Remember what I said? We don't often see God mentioned in the book of Ruth, but we very much see God working in and through their lives. And this one sentence, though it doesn't look like much, starts this chain reaction. Because if you notice, Naomi's family left the promised land. They left God instead of repenting and staying in the promised land. When they left, that's when all of their misfortune happened. But now we see, though she is empty, she comes back with one foreign daughter-in-law whose husband is dead. Her son is dead. And all she comes back with is Ruth. But Naomi has chosen to come back. She's chosen to come back to the promised land. And though she has hit rock bottom, she is back where she's supposed to be. She is back. She has U-turned her life back and come back to God. Is she happy about it? No. Is she bitter and angry and resentful? Absolutely. But she has come back to God. And that's when things begin to shift. They arrived in late spring. This was not a coincidence that they arrived right when the harvest season starts with the first round of crops, which is barley. Here we see one of the most important themes at work. Even through the everyday choices and sinful choices sometimes of God's people, even in the worst of, because can you imagine? What's the worst thing that can happen? It is kind of Naomi's situation. You lose everyone in your family. You lose all your financial security. You lose every source of hope for the future. You literally have nothing but the clothes on your back and some girl you got to take care of, who can't speak the language. Even in the worst of circumstances, God is working. And God begins to move when they make their way back to God. Here we see in chapter 2, as we keep moving, nothing is a coincidence, nothing is an accident. Because Ruth and Naomi's greatest immediate need right now is food. They need food on the table, okay? So right when they return is when harvest starts. But long before Naomi was even alive, during the time of Moses, remember how Moses gave the Israelites many different commands and laws to keep. These were rules that the Israelites were to follow that made them different from all the other nations around them. Here we see two laws that God had put in place long before Naomi's time. And we see God's heart through these laws. The first law is this. If a widow, so if a woman, her family dies, right? Her husband dies. Does it sound familiar? Her sons die, leaving her nothing. When that happens, the next nearest family is to take her in and continue that dead son's name. Does that make sense? And so it's kind of like, okay, everyone in your family dies. Your nearest male relative takes you in and cares for you, provides for you, and the children you have are not that family's children. They are your dead husband's children, so that your husband's name does not die out. Does that make sense? So in other words, that family relative has to provide for you, support you, but there's nothing at the end for that person, right? You're just helping your family. But that law was put in place so that widows who have nothing would get protected. In a time and a culture where everybody else, women in that time, were second-rate citizens, God had these laws in place to protect the most vulnerable people in society. The second law we see at play here now is that God told them, when it's harvest time, do not harvest all the way to the corner of your fields. In other words, if you get a paycheck, okay, and say you get paid $500 that day, God is saying, don't deposit all $500 into your account. Leave like $50 behind so that someone who needs the money can have it instead. That's what God is saying. So that those who are orphans, those who are widows, those who are poor, those who are sojourning, those who have no home, that they can still have food. Nobody did that in that culture at that time. But this is what God said to his people. You will be different than the rest of the nations around you, because my heart is to care for the poor and the widow and the orphan and the one that society often oppresses and takes advantage of. Those are the ones that I want you to protect, because that reflects my heart for my people. And so those two laws actually end up protecting Ruth and Naomi, because Ruth goes out to harvest barley. And we see, remember, they just so happen to land during barley season. Ruth just so happens to go out to the field of a man named Boaz. He has many fields. He's very rich. Okay? If your goal in life is to marry a rich husband, she has landed the jackpot. Okay? She ends up in the exact field of Boaz, who is Naomi's one of the nearest family members who can redeem her family. Okay? She just so happens to land in the right field. And that exact day that Ruth gets there, Boaz happens to be at that exact field. And he happens to see her among the hundreds of servants harvesting his field. And he happens to ask the person next to him, do you know who that is? And that person happens to know who this foreign girl is. It's Naomi's daughter-in-law. Is this all a coincidence? Is this all an accident? My friends, it is not. Ruth and Naomi do not know it yet. But even in their lowest moment, when they come back to God, God is already starting to release and work behind the scenes to redeem this family. It is not a coincidence that Ruth ends up exactly where she's supposed to be. And so Boaz sees her, and he's like, wow, you are so loyal to your mother-in-law that as a foreign woman, you're going to choose to protect your mother-in-law, work for her, because there's no way Naomi can do that work, okay? And so Boaz begins to see Ruth's character and realizes she is loyal and has more faith than most of the women who are Israelites there, okay? So here we are in chapter 3. And Naomi hears about this, and she's like, what? You end up in the exact field of the family guy who's going to redeem our family? Like, keep going there. And Naomi, she's you know those like ajumas who are like matchmaking? Okay, that's how Naomi's like. Naomi's like, you better change your clothes. You got to look better than that when you go out to work, okay? She's like, Naomi's like, okay, Ruth, you got to do your best. So a few months goes by, and now it's the wheat harvest. And Boaz still hasn't said anything to Ruth. And Naomi's like, okay. She's like, you know what? Wachamo. Like, she's like, I cannot wait any longer. I got to help this situation out. She is a sweet, meddling, matchmaking ajma. And so she's like, Ruth, here's what you're going to do. You're going to go to Boaz. At night, when it's just the men gathered threshing the wheat, you're going to go and you're basically going to propose to Boaz. That's what she says. And Ruth says, okay, I'll do it. So if anyone ever says only the guy can propose, I'm just kidding. Ruth is the one who did it first. So here's Ruth, goes and follows exactly what her mother-in-law says. And Boaz is shocked by her. He's so surprised. Here we see in Ruth 3, verse 9 to 10, Boaz looks up and he sees Ruth there in the middle of the night at his feet. And he's like, who are you? And she goes, I'm your servant Ruth. And what she says here is, spread the corner of your covering, for you are my family redeemer. What that means is she's saying, will you cover me, protect me, take me under your wing? Will you redeem my family? In other words, will you marry me so that through you we can continue the family line? In other words, what she's also asking is that their first son would not be Boaz's son. It would be the son of Naomi's family that would continue the family line. So she's also putting herself out there and risking a lot to ask this. And yet, Boaz's response is this: the Lord bless you. You are showing even more family loyalty now than you did before, for you have not gone after a younger man, whether rich or poor. So we see a little bit here why Boaz hesitated and didn't reach out to Ruth first. It's because they had a kind of a bigger age gap. He was rich, but he was kind of older. But Ruth was like, you know what? I'm not going to go after other people. I'm going to do and be faithful to my family and do what God has called me to do. And so we see here that Boaz and Ruth both demonstrate faith and humility and trust in God. So now this man is on a mission, okay? Because Boaz has done his homework. He's realized there is one other man who is actually next in line to redeem their family. Not Boaz. Boaz is second in line. But he's going to do it right. And so what he does is he goes out in the morning, gathers all the elders of the town. So there's official witnesses, okay? And he's like, look, man, you want this land? Do you want... Because it's not just marrying Ruth, it's getting all of the inheritance and land that should have been Naomi's sons. And he's like, well, sure, land, great. He's like, but you have to also marry Ruth. And your children won't be yours, but that child is going to be like Naomi's family's. And so this man says, no way, I don't want to do that. And so he takes off his sandal, which is like an official contract that time, saying, I toss that in. It's not mine anymore. I don't want to do it. And so Boaz secures that next in line place, that he will redeem the family. Here we see kind of like a happily ever after story, a redemption story, a total 180, that the woman who left came back with nothing but one foreign daughter-in-law. But through that daughter-in-law's faith and courage, their whole family is redeemed. We see that they get married, they have a son, but it's not just any son. In Ruth 4, we see this. Verse 14, next slide, our next verse passage. Woman of the town said to Naomi, praise the Lord who has now provided a redeemer for your family. He has taken back what was rightfully yours and given it to you. May this son be famous in Israel. And they named him Obed. Obed became the father of Jesse, and Jesse was the father of King David. It's not just anything, any son. Do you remember God's promise to Abraham back in the day? Through your family will come a Savior, a Messiah who will save the world. That person traces down to King David, to eventually who? Jesus. So in that moment, they have no idea. But what they have done is they have actually preserved that line through which one day Jesus would come. One day. Through Ruth's story, we see over and over again that God is at work in the everyday joys and everyday sufferings of his people to fulfill his good work. What's going on right now in your life? Maybe it's simple things, joyful things, hard things, difficult things. Maybe work is hard right now. Maybe you're worried about the future. Maybe you're sick or someone in your family is sick. Maybe you've lost somebody recently in your family. Whatever issues are happening or things that are happening in your life, even in the lowest of times, God is still at work behind the scenes to redeem, to make right, to take back. What we see here is that no one is beyond the reach of God's redemption. No life circumstance is beyond the reach of God's redemption. No one thing you've done is beyond the reach of God redeeming and making right again.